Hey everyone, welcome to today's video titled Intel's Last Dance. And I think truly this is Intel's last dance in some sorts. I don't think that Intel will go bankrupt, but they have one last shot at, not becoming a new IBM. Remember, IBM was a huge company back in the days, but now, although they are not, bankrupted, but they're nowhere near the size or the importance as they were, 20 years ago. And the question is Intel gonna be the new IBM or is Intel gonna be the new AMD, which kind of 8 years ago in 2016 were essentially on the verge of bankruptcy. Like in 2016, AMD stock was, around two or so US dollar, even less than $2 in 2015 late. But then with some smart inventions, especially with the chiplet designs on the CPU server side, they managed to claw back market share against, Intel, and now the stock is doing good and the company is doing good over the long term, although maybe last year hasn't been the best. But the question is, can Intel be the new AMD or the new IBM? So starting with the different segments, I think the importance here is that to understand what of these segments are gonna essentially make the case that Intel is gonna turn the ship around. I think the computing and graphics segment, so essentially the laptop CPUs that they sell to the Dells, to the Lenovo's or HPs and Asus and so on and so forth, they are still a very big market, like 7 billion, which is essentially their by far biggest market in terms of revenue at the current stage, or the biggest segment. Then we have obviously the data center, which used to be actually, when it comes to Intel, the data center used to be much larger. If we go back here, we can see on line 38. Let's have a quick look here. We can see that they used to have, 7.3 billion in Q4 of 2021 of just pure data center revenue, right? But then what happened is AMD started to eat into the market share, and Intel decided to not lose as much as market share as possible by the way of essentially giving away their chips for free. So either you lose market share, but you kind of sustain your pricing level, or you go the other way and you make it really difficult for AMD to take market share, but at the same time you lose your margin. And this is what's happening. Look at it. They went from around 30% margin in the data center AI to just around 9 to 10% currently. But as well also losing revenue. I mean, the revenue has gone from 7 billion in 3 years ago to 3 billion in this very, very important area of the company. So they also reduced the dividend recently, so that's another issue for the shareholders. But I think another important segment for the company that could potentially actually be a savior to some degree is the network and edge, because as you have these AI GPUs, although Intel necessarily haven't ventured that big into AI GPUs, remember that Nvidia is the king, and whatever leftovers are there, AMD is picking up. Nvidia's probably gonna ship around 80-90 billion in AI GPU sales this year, and and AMD the rest around 5 to 6. So yeah, Intel was supposed to do half a billion this year, but even that seems to be a stretch now, according to the latest earnings. But yeah, so I think the network and edge could potentially, if Intel gets a foothold in the AI GPU, it could really, really explode from here. But that's not a certain kind of reality that we are basing our bets on. I think the most important one is Intel Foundry. The company's last dance is gonna be decided by the success of Intel Foundry. And they are saying that Intel 18A progresses well, but remember that they've been saying a lot of stuff have been progressing very well over the past 5 years, and most of it hasn't been true. Although I do think that, in my view, looking at the signals coming out from the industry insiders, I do believe that Intel 18A is gonna be good. I don't say it's gonna, completely outshine TSMC, but I think they're gonna be very, very competitive with the best TSMC nodes. And I think one area that most people miss, if 18A is somewhat okay, remember that Intel 3 was actually launched last year. It was somewhat okay, I would say. I generally think that the reviews for Grand Rapids and especially Sierra Forest was fairly good. Although we have, recently had AMD's Zen 5 Epic CPUs launching, and they are obviously better than Intel's Granite Rapids, for example. But I think most people are very happy with the performance of Intel 3. And the interesting part is that Intel 18A seems to be a much, much bigger jump. And AMD is going to be stuck on this fifth generation Zen, because I do not think that the Zen 6 lineup that I have pointed here for AMD in 2025, I don't think they will launch it, at least not to the very, very last few quarter, probably last few months of 2025, which means that Zen 6 based EPIC lineup is mostly a 2026 setup, I would say, potentially late 2025. But I do believe that Intel 18A will essentially equal every advantage that AMD has currently. Because remember that they, for a brief moment this year, for let's say a few weeks, Intel actually started to essentially eating very close to AMD's performance on the CPU in the server side. But when it comes to the updated version of EPIC that launched just on the 10th of October, a month ago, essentially, AMD again raised the bar. But now it's Intel's turn with 18A. And I don't know, it's very difficult because we know that, for example, Intel just recently launched Intel Arrow Lake on the desktop consumer side, right? And honestly, look at this. So the poll says that 56%, almost 60% has a negative view on this, and almost 40% has a mediocre view of this, which means that essentially 90% of the consumers are not happy with Arrow Lake, which was a bummer, to be honest. Remember that Arrow Lake might not have been that good, but if you go to the consumer tab here, I think actually in terms of the mobile APUs, so let's see here, Intel Panther Lake is going to be launched next year, but for this year they're going to go with Lunar Lake that launched in late summer. Seems fairly good, I would say, especially on the power consumption, which is going to be very competitive with best of the new threats coming from Qualcomm and even next year potentially from Nvidia. So this is also playing into the dynamic that not only is Intel facing the challenge from AMD on mostly the CPU side of the stuff, they're facing and fighting with TSMC, although I think they're gonna get into a better footing in terms of manufacturing wise with TSMC. There are also just the additional made in US, and being a US made company, I don't think it's the US industry will let Intel to go far below these kind of levels. So my point of view is that although the threat is increasing in every single market, remember AMD on the CPU side, desktop and consumer, but as well on the cloud space, the big CPU server farms from Google or Microsoft. In fact, if you look at Microsoft, I think they're also pushing people not only towards AMD but as well their own ARM-based CPUs for server workloads, and that is not only a threat to Intel but also AMD, because we are seeing that ARM is taking a foothold to some degree. Obviously, x86 is by far the biggest segment, probably 85% of the market, but it wasn't far ago that x86 for Intel and AMD had essentially 99% of the market share. And of that 99% was Intel 95%. Now the entire x86 is losing step by step, quarter by quarter, but as well is AMD eating into the majority of Intel share. So it's a lot of stuff going on at the same time. Nvidia rumored, and most likely, I mean, they are hinting at getting definitely into the CPU space for also the consumer. So in the laptop segment, so if you go back to the earnings, you can see that in this specific area of computer graphics, which is their biggest area, they're gonna face even bigger threats. But again, I believe that if they manage to pull 18A off, it's gonna be the last dance, that they're gonna be becoming a new AMD. If they manage to pull, if 18A disappoints, I think genuinely that this is, at least for the five or so upcoming years, is this stock is not gonna do anything. But so it's really important to see early next year what are the signs. But I don't know. I think there are a few people there, not a lot of people, but there's a few of them. For example, this gentleman here, that Mojo, if you should give him a follow on Twitter, I think he also kind of is in the same boat as me. I think that they are gonna be very competitive in performance-wise with 18A, and they have this new, let's say, innovation with the backside power delivery, which TSMC won't utilize until at least 1 year or 2 years later than Intel. And in addition to the backside power delivery, they also have this other innovation gate all around, And both of these new innovations will give Intel, in terms of pure physics and performance of the transistors, somewhat advantage compared to TSMC and Samsung. So do I think that Intel is as much behind TSMC as they were, back in 2020, 2019, or 2021? No, absolutely not. Intel 3 was one step in the right direction, still well behind TSMC. Let's be honest. Intel 3, which was launched late last year, was competing with the nodes that TSMC was already utilizing in 2022. So Intel 3 is essentially equivalent to TSMC 4 or some of the worst N3s in TSMC. But the interesting part is that TSMC volume production of the 2 nanometer chips was supposed essentially in the beginning to be in this year. Now it's postponed to late next year. I doubt even that the next generation iPhone will have TSMC 2 nanometer. It might be that maybe one of the versions of the iPhone, maybe 17 Pro Max, is gonna have the TSMC 2 nanometer. But I doubt that all the entire Apple lineup, the 17, the 17 Pro, the Pro Max, and just the iPhone 17 Plus, that all four of them are gonna utilize the TSMC 2 nanometer. I don't think the yield is up there right now, which means that volume production, the pure volume, is for 2026, which means that Intel will have somewhat an advantage. And let's be honest, who is Intel competing with in these different markets? If you go to the data center, they're essentially only active in the CPUs, and they're fighting with AMD, right? And if you go to AMD, what are their data centers based on? So the AMD's data center, the latest Zen 5 are based on the I/O die. I think is still on in the TSMC 6 nanometer, and the compute die is I think on TSMC 3 for the more compact Turing dense, so the Zen 5C cores, whereas the normal big Zen 5 cores are I think based on 4 nanometer if I recall, which means that Intel 18A on paper should have an advantage on most of AMD's server lineup next year. I do think that they will at the bare minimum have the same kind of power envelope, and I wouldn't be surprised if Intel takes the lead in a few areas. So yeah, I think everything hangs on this, Intel Foundry business. So let's not have a look at the unnecessary numbers. Like the numbers are looking really, really bad. I could use many, many worse words than that, but I think the numbers are not good. Guidance is not good. Although this single quarter was even probably one of the worst due to some one-time write-offs, but I think even next quarter is going to be bad, and probably even Q1 of next year and Q2 of next year. But the question is, if 18A is a success, how much higher will the stock go? And let me be frank with you, if 18A is a success, they're gonna start to turn around and regain leadership in a lot of these areas, network and edge, data center and AI. They're gonna get a lot of edge in, the laptop CPU market. A lot of companies are gonna start to use their external foundries for Intel. The likes of Nvidia might see even, and we have seen many rumors out there that even Jensen Huang, the Nvidia CEO, is looking at it. And I think everything plays into Intel hands if, but this is a really big if they manage to pull 18A off. And in that scenario, honestly, I think this stock at current is sitting at 100 billion. I can easily see with 18A success and continuing doing well with 14A and so on and so forth, this stock would, in 3 years from now, if 18A is correct and in terms of volume production, could easily be 5, 6, 700 billion company, easily. I wouldn't, be surprised at all. But that is, again, a lot of ifs and buts. But again, you're taking a bet here. It might be that maybe there is only 40% chance that they get a success of 18A against TSMC. But if they do that, I like the odds, to be honest. I like the odds, and I acknowledge that it's really bad in terms of, everything is negative about Intel these days. But when everything is negative, that's when you make the most money as well, if they manage to turn it around, which AMD kind of did. And I'm happy that I invested in AMD in 2015 and 2016. I was a really, really young investor back then, and somehow, without not a lot of knowledge, I kind of felt that was the right time. Let's see if Intel can do the same. Obviously, I won't expect Intel to 100x that AMD did at some point, but I think 10 to 20, even 30x is possible. Intel managing, being the 2030s fab like TSMC was the 2020s fab, they could easily be a $4 trillion company, in 2030. So yeah, thanks for watching. Please engage in the discussion. I'm really, really keen to see what you guys think. I think this is a really interesting option, and please don't shoot the messenger. I'm just trying to share my own ideas here. And yeah, so thank you for your time, and see you in the next one.